Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 most disappointing cards from Kobolds and Catacombs. And when I say disappointing, what I mean by that is these are essentially cards that were overrated by the Hearthstone community. I went to the Vicious Syndicate pre-release poll for Kobolds and Catacombs, where thousands and thousands of Hearthstone community members rated each of the cards in the expansion from 1 to 5 stars. And all the cards on this list got great ratings, and people thought they were going to be good, meta-shaping, powerful cards, but it turns out these cards just aren't being played very much right now, where people tested them and they just failed, meaning that we all got these wrong. We thought they were going to be great, and so far, they aren't too good. Now, I do want to say that just because a card's on this list, that doesn't mean I think it's fundamentally bad. In fact, I think a lot of the cards on this list still have the chance to be good. Like, they're fundamentally solid and sound. Their stat lines make sense. Their effects are strong. They aren't too overcosted. But they just haven't found an archetype or a meta yet to support them. So it doesn't mean I'm giving like hope up on these cards completely. I think there's still a chance. But for now, from what we've seen in the first few weeks of the expansion play, these cards have not delivered as promised. They are not as good as we expected them to be right away, so therefore they are, for now, a little bit disappointing. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into the list. So up first at the number 5 spot for the 5th most disappointing Kobolds and Catacombs card, we have Grumble, World Shaker. Now this was a card that was ranked in the top 25 of all cards for the expansion, rated higher than things like Call to Arms, for instance, one of the best cards in the entire set. People thought this one was going to be really solid. But as it stands right now, Grumble World Shaker just isn't working. When you look at the data, he's only being played in 0.2% of decks, so less than 1% of decks, and those decks right now have less than a 42% win rate, which is just abysmal. So Grumble World Shaker, Elemental Shaman, almost really just Shaman in general, is struggling, and as strong as people thought this card was going to be, myself included, right now, that's just not the case. Now, for Grumble World Shaker, this is one of those cards I think is fundamentally solid. It has great stats, a cool effect, elemental synergies. So I have not given up hope yet on Grumble World Shaker. I still think this someday will be a good card. I think a meta change, especially with the next standard format rotation coming in just a few months, could enable a card like this one to really stand out and find some strength in a new meta and in a new environment. So I'm not saying Grumble is terrible. He's not brokenly bad in and of himself. Just right now, he has certainly been disappointing because people thought he was going to be a defining kind of card. They thought Elemental Shaman was going to be a very successful sort of archetype. We all rated this card really highly, but for now, he's just not good enough to make the cut. So Grumble World Shaker, the 5th most disappointing card in Kobolds and Catacombs. Moving on to the number 4 spot, we have Hooked Reaver, the Warlock card. This is another one that the community rated as one of the 25 best cards in the expansion, higher than things like Call to Arms, Carnivorous Cube, Valenier. People thought this card was going to be very solid. And despite the fact that Warlock has found a ton of success in Kobolds and Catacombs as one of the most played, if not the most played class, Hooked Reaver isn't making the cut, even though it seems like this could be a good control style card, and we're seeing a lot of control Warlocks. Right now, the fact that Hooked Reaver is a demon is actually more punishing than helpful, because Q-Block, of course, is the primary archetype for Warlock, and they need a specific set of demons to pull from their possessed lackeys and their Skull of the Manari, and Hooked Reaver just doesn't fit into that environment. So right now, Hooked Reaver is being played in less than 1% of decks, and it only has a 42% win rate when it's being played. So despite people thinking this was going to be good, despite the fact that Warlock is at the very, very top of the charts, Hooked Reaver still isn't making the cut. It's just not good enough right now in Hearthstone. That said, I still think this is a card that has potential in the future. Maybe not quite as much as I thought originally after seeing it in action. It just doesn't often do all that much as a 7/7 taunt even at turn 4, and you don't always only have 15 health at turn 4. So the math doesn't line up as perfectly as I thought, or probably a lot of other people thought as well. That doesn't mean it won't ever be played. It's just probably not going to be as strong as a lot of us thought. Might eventually see some play here and there, but it's not going to be one of the best cards or most memorable or most defining cards in the set by any means. So pretty clearly, Hooked Reaver has been a bit of a disappointment. Moving on to the number 3 spot, we have another Shaman card. This time around, it's Unstable Evolution. And this was actually rated as one of the 10 best cards by the Hearthstone community. People thought this was going to really be a standout card. Myself included, I absolutely adore the idea of Unstable Evolution. I thought this thing was going to be a perfect fit for Evolved Shaman, which looked like a strong archetype coming into the new expansion. But as it turns out, Evolved Shaman just isn't good enough to compete at the higher tiers. There's so many decks and classes that got a lot stronger in Kobolds and Catacombs, and Shaman just didn't keep up. Unstable Evolution wasn't enough to empower that deck to do crazy things or to reinvent itself at the power level that we've seen all these other decks. So right now, Unstable Evolution is being played in fewer than 1% of decks, and it only has a 45% win rate when it's played, neither of which are very compelling or great arguments for this card's success. It just seems like being part of Shaman, being bundled with a class that's struggling, these cards aren't good enough. They just don't make up the difference that Shaman needs, and therefore they're disappointing because we thought they were going to be good enough. We thought they were going to be defining and powerful and really reshape things for the class, but instead they've just fallen short. And even though we thought this card was one of the 10 best in the entire set, right now you virtually never see this. It's a lot of fun to play, it's just not very good to play. Moving on to the number 2 spot, we have another card with a similar story here. Ley Line Manipulator is one of those cards that just looks right. Great stat line for its cost, a very powerful effect, an elemental synergy tag, much like Grumble. It's a card that just looks like it should be fantastic, but when you look at the raw data for how this thing is performing so far in Kobolds and Catacombs, it's just not adding up. Now, perhaps that's just another case of there's no deck to support this card right now. I still believe in Ley Line Manipulator. I still think it has a chance to be good. I don't think this is a signal necessarily that the card itself is a complete and utter failure, just that the meta isn't supporting it. But that said, we still rated this as one of the 5 best cards in the expansion. In fact, this was the number 4 card on the list in the Vicious Syndicate pre-release poll. So people absolutely loved Ley Line Manipulator. I gave this one 5 stars myself, but right now it's being played in less than 1% of decks, and in decks that play it only have a 40% win rate. That is abysmal. So I don't know that you can just blame the archetype necessarily. It seems like nothing about this card is improving elemental mage decks. There are even, grinder style, big style mages, which could seemingly fit this card, but decks that run it just seem to fail. So I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just, certain meta lineups, certain matchups don't make sense for this one. It just falls short. Maybe card generation just isn't there for this one to discount them significantly enough. It doesn't fit, for instance, in Quest Mage, which is a deck that does rely on card generation. So something isn't adding up for Ley Line Manipulator, despite all the obvious signs that this card should be good enough to make a deck good, that this card should be a centerpiece of just a super powerhouse style card that empowers some deck or fits in Mage. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense yet. So Ley Line Manipulator, to me, probably actually the most disappointing card of all. I thought this guy was going to just change the game and be so strong that you had to build a deck around him. And yet he never sees play, and when I've tested him, it sure is hard to make him work. So right now, Ley Line Manipulator is a huge disappointment. And now finally, for the most disappointing card of all, in Kobolds and Catacombs, we have Warriors Reckless Flurry. Now, this was rated in the top 15 of all cards in the pre-release poll. People thought this one was going to be really solid. It beat out a ton of staple cards as far as its rating was concerned. I think people just reacted that, having this consistent of a board clear for Warrior seemed like it was going to be great, particularly with all these armor gain cards like Dry Whisker Armor that were being added into the Warrior card set. But as it turns out, Reckless Flurry seems to, in fact, endanger your deck when you play it. It is almost impossible to make this card work really well. Right now, when this card is played, you have less than a 40% win rate, which is just absolutely awful. That is unfathomably bad. Now, Warrior, of course, is struggling. Control Warrior struggling. But there have been a ton of people who have played Control Warrior decks and even Armor Warrior decks to high Legend spots. They play it 2 Legend, they play it at the top tiers of Legend. Names like Fibonacci come to mind, but even Tice has built a cool Control Warrior deck. None of them are running Reckless Flurry. It just doesn't make sense for the class. Sacrificing your life gain in order to clear the board just doesn't seem to be worth it when Warrior already has great ways to clear the board. There's already Whirlwind and Sleep with the Fishes. There's already Brawls for those wide board clears too. So essentially, they don't need Reckless Flurry. It's a tool that doesn't make sense. The risk-reward balance is far too weighted in terms of risk, and there's just not enough reward to make up for it. There's a huge opportunity cost for running this card. So people reacted really strongly to this one. Although I have to say, I actually didn't. I thought that this was going to be a problematic card because you're sacrificing that life. So this is the one I maybe got sort of kind of right on this list, if any of them. But it also turns out that it's just terrible. It just doesn't make sense. Now, I'm sure somebody out there is going to say they've had some great story where Reckless Flurry was perfect for them. That's great. Maybe you found the one unicorn-style list that just made it work. But when you look at the numbers, when you look at the experience of the community as a whole, Reckless Flurry has been the most disappointing of all. People had huge expectations, and it has drastically underperformed, and that's why it takes the #1 spot on my list. And there you have it, folks. Those are the 5 most disappointing cards from Kobolds and Catacombs. Now, again, I just want to reinforce that this list doesn't mean these cards are necessarily just awful. They may not be bad cards in a vacuum. They might actually be decent cards in a vacuum when you look at their stats and their effects. All of that's fine, but in practice, in execution, in actual on-the-board Hearthstone right now, these cards just aren't living up to their expectations. People thought they were going to be good enough to carve out decks or to reshape the meta, and they're not doing that. They're not seeing play. Maybe one day they will. I'm not saying your favorite card is terrible. I'm just saying it's not being played right now, and that, therefore, just makes it a disappointment at the moment. That said, if you guys have any other cards you were surprised weren't on this list, other cards you think have failed monumentally, other cards I missed, maybe you have an argument for why one of these cards is good, of course, I'd love to hear those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.